you, Jeremy.
Okay, thanks so much, Hannah. And then if I could remind you to make me a co-host so I could share my screen because I will be using images. Is that possible?
Yeah.
Okay, terrific. So I'll get going. I mean, first, let me say I'm honored to participate. I would like to thank Andy, not just for the gift of this conference, but for his tireless dedication to this issue. Among advocates in the United States, he's viewed with deep admiration. He has unparalleled knowledge about the detained men and an uncanny ability to frame the outrage of Guantanamo with such meticulous, fact-based, clarity. So I just wanted to, pay Andy that honor. Also thank Sarah and Hannah and Chris and others who made this conference possible. So in my short time, I want to focus on grassroots activism in the United States to close Guantanamo, something that's been largely neglected by the media and actually rarely mentioned in the voluminous literature on the prison. Specifically, I'd like to narrate the history of that activism, drawing on my own personal involvement in it, and dividing that activism into phases based on the shifting themes and goals of our effort. And this might function as a loose periodization of Guantanamo itself. Put otherwise, I want to fuse the personal, the political, and the historical in this sort of broad brush narrative of what by now is 2 decades of efforts to close Guantanamo. I will indeed use images to enhance my narrative. So with that, let me share my screen. Okay, so can people see an image of people sitting around a table? Okay, very good, cool. So, my story, 9/11 happens, the war on terror is born. I protest the Afghanistan and Iraq wars, but what most offends my moral sensibility is the torture. I recall very vividly watching the images of Abu Ghraib and the efforts to rationalize the abuse on TV and feeling absolutely destroyed. The sense that this is beyond the pale. I'm aware of the long history of American violence, but I thought that by now certain basic principles, innocent until proven guilty, the right to some basic due process, the right not to be tortured, were inviolable, or at least couldn't be evacuated altogether. And yet all of those abuses were happening, and it felt as if the entire foundations of the Enlightenment were crumbling before my eyes. I got very angry, would shake my fist at the television saying somebody ought to do something, and the fingers of my hand pointed back at me, and I realized that that somebody indeed had to be me as well. Now fast forward roughly 10 years and you see in the image before you a group from Witness Against Torture in 2015 in Cuba, just across from the US naval bases to your right-hand side, engaging in a week-long protest of the ongoing detention of the men. We did this action during Thanksgiving, which in the United States is a time of gathering with family and feasting on turkey, but we chose to fast during this period. Why? Because the men at Guantanamo had been kidnapped and separated from their families for over a decade for most of them, and many of them at the time were on hunger strike opposing their detention. So we chose to separate ourselves from our families to not eat as a small act of recognition of and solidarity with the men still suffering inside Guantanamo. I'll share a couple of other images from that trip. Here I am, somber, sitting at the table. So what happened to get me over the course of a decade, physically to Guantanamo itself? Well, around the time of Abu Ghraib, I learned of this remarkable trip made in December 2005 of 25 Americans to Guantanamo that at the time defied the travel ban to Cuba. Bush had said, if you're concerned about Guantanamo, why don't you come and see for yourselves? And a bunch of Americans took him at his word, went as close to the base as they could, engaged in 3 days of prayer and fasting. News of their presence apparently made it inside the base itself, and to the detained men themselves. And this seemed like, a bold and striking and powerful protest. And it's worth noting that this group in formation, Witness Against Torture, thought that Guantanamo was the low-hanging fruit of the war on terror, right? It was so patently illegal, so outrageous, and so universally condemned by Amnesty International, the UN, et cetera, they thought that closing Guantanamo soon was achievable because it was so outrageous. When the group made it back to the United States, I joined them. And this commences really, I think, the first phase of anti-Guantanamo activism, which is what I call the rule of law phase. Our overarching goal was to make the detained men subjects before the law, endowed with legal and human rights. Put otherwise, our goal was to help them secure what they insisted they most wanted, the ability to challenge their detention before some competent tribunal. And that meant, as a practical matter, their ability to secure rights of habeas corpus. And then for the first few years, most of our actions were oriented towards the achievement of that goal. The most dramatic was our successful effort to take over and actually shut down the Supreme Court with a presence both inside and outside of the building. And then significantly, when under arrest, rather than giving our own names, we gave the names of detained men who we were representing. And then the idea was to, as we challenged our arrests, symbolically give the men the day in court that they had been deprived by the United States legal system. So we always wanted our actions to, embody the goal towards which they were directed. And then this was a clever form of solidarity with the detained men. And again, an effort to give them symbolically the day in court that they had been denied. And I think the first time Shakir Amr appeared on a US legal docket was Shakir Amr versus USA. And then this was the case of a young man, I believe, who took your name, Shakir, when he was arrested, and the official naming of that trial was the USA versus Shakir Amr. This phase was, so we thought, successful. The Boumediene decision indeed granted habeas corpus rights. This was a tremendous legal victory. Even better, Obama roars into office with the promise to close Guantanamo. Day one, he issues an executive order to close it within a year. There's tremendous jubilation in our community, but also a sense of vigilance that we need to hold the administration to its word and back them in achieving their own policy. Unfortunately, the policy was never realized, pushing us into a second phase, which I call the defeat from the jaws of victory phase, or, as I'll explain in a second, the political phase of the struggle. The policy went, horribly awry. Republicans in Congress demagogued the issue. There was pushback against the transfer of people in the military commissions to stand trial in the continental United States. And then above all, the administration walked away from its own goal because it was too difficult to achieve politically. And specifically, they didn't want to antagonize the Republican Party and jeopardize bipartisan support for Obama's domestic agenda, Obamacare, financial reform, etc. And then they basically decided not to press the issue because they wanted to look forward and not backward, and sort of lead the country in bipartisan legislation. So the men at Guantanamo were essentially sold out for a sucker's deal. As you may recall, Obama got exactly 0 Republican votes for Obamacare. And the men at Guantanamo were victims to a very, very cynical political calculation that the Obama administration made. And then this is a betrayal for which a lot of us, I think, will never forgive the administration. Part of our vigilance was a literal vigil in the cold of January outside the White House. A friend of mine wrote a beautiful song whose line was, "It's time to be honest, you can't blame it on Congress. President Obama, make good on your promise." Of course, he didn't make good on that promise. Here's more indication of the dissatisfaction with Obama's policies. This pushed us into the next phase of activism, which I call the "you are not forgotten" phase, where our goal was to let the world, and most especially let the men remaining in Guantanamo, know that they weren't forgotten, that somebody still cared about their humanity, about their fate, about their destiny. And we were trying, in the face of enormous challenges, to do what we could. One of our actions was to put a death shroud in the Capitol, in a part of it called the Temple of Freedom, in the very spot where Rosa Parks and ex-dead presidents have, laid in wait. And this is a shroud with the name of 3 men who allegedly committed suicide in 2006. During this phase, the main slogan for our activism was "broken laws, broken lives, broken promises," which I think captures the first term of the Obama administration. By the time he wins re-election, there's little rational hope that anything can be done to make the men anything less than forever prisoners in a forever prison. This is an action on January 11th, 2009, after Obama's re-election. We were hoping he would inaugurate justice. Instead, we were left with, a sad and seemingly static condition of 200 plus men still in Guantanamo. Things changed with the hunger strike in Guantanamo itself of 2012, 2013. And then public advocacy in the United States and around the world roared back to life. We were pushed into the streets. This is a demonstration at Times Square, another demonstration at Times Square. And then this is what I call the solidarity phase of the struggle, where the emphasis was less on law, the rule of law, the integrity of the law, and more on trying to humanize and dramatize the plight of individual men. And then the notion is that individual stories can be more compelling than the appeal to abstract legal principles. This was the great era of force feedings. There was a fellow in the United States, Andreas Contreras, who fasted for something like 110 days and submitted himself to 3 voluntary nasogastric feedings, one of them in front of the White House. You might know Medea Benjamin, the head of Code Pink, standing off to the side. I was standing right next to her, but what was being done was so gruesome. It was the one time in my life that I had to physically separate myself from any of our protests because it was so overwhelming and viscerally disturbing. On the more positive side, this was the great era of campaigning on behalf of individual detainees. The campaign to free Shaker Amr was, the most, celebrated worldwide. A lot of you were involved in the English end of this effort, though protests on Shaker's behalf existed all over the world. The famous Shaker doll made it to the United States. Briefly, it was in my possession, which I considered a great honor. Here, Shaker is outside the White House with Andy speaking in front of him. And I wish the photo wasn't so blurry, but it's a lovely image. It wasn't just Shaker. There were others on whose behalf we stood. This is me with a sign. This is my adorable son with a sign. These are some other detained men who we were advocating for. And this phase of the campaign was to a remarkable degree successful. evident in the freedom, notwithstanding the trauma and the wounds of Shakir Amr. One of the great satisfactions of my life was the ability to meet with him and have my son meet with him. Andy and Joanne McInnes, facilitated this, and it was just tremendous. And then during this period, we developed, I think, a new sense of how to measure success and failure. And we realized that Guantanamo, probably wasn't going to close in any great fell swoop. Rather, we could grind out releases one by one. And each release represented a kind of transcendent victory. There's a phrase common to many faiths that if you save one life, you save all of humanity. And then that really guided us. And when Shakir was freed, it really felt like all of humanity had been saved. And as each additional man was freed, it felt again like all humanity would be saved. So this was, a sort of cosmic way to measure the fruits of our labors. This phase was followed by what I then call the anti-racist phase of Guantanamo activism, coincident with Black Lives Matter 1.0 in the wake of Ferguson. And then here, the idea was to see Guantanamo as a manifestation of systemic racism, right? A form of state violence inflicted on, brown-skinned bodies demonized as criminals. And then the recognition that racism had a domestic reality, that a lot of the abuses at Guantanamo are routine within the domestic American prison system, and to try to make connections between overseas war on terror incarceration and mass incarceration at home shot through with racism. I should say that this dimension of our activism was enhanced by the growing presence of Muslim leaders within our group and within our movement, chiefly but not exclusively Maha Halal, who will give a presentation later today. Here are two Muslims praying at Guantanamo, again, a very moving image. And then they, made the advocacy community see how pervasive and pernicious Islamophobia is as a dimension of the entire Guantanamo saga. The culmination really of all these phases for me personally was this 2015 trip to Guantanamo itself. In some profound sense, the demand had not changed. President and Congress, closed Guantanamo. So, here we were, in a sense, echoing our own moral insistence, which had remained more or less unbroken for a decade, but the setting and circumstances made this moment of protest especially powerful. During our time there, we had a ceremony where we would say the name and recite the story and sort of behold and display a photograph of each detained man. And we also continue to do specific advocacy around specific individuals. And this is Tariq Ba-Oda, a man who at the time weighed something like 98 pounds. His lawyer said he looked like a concentration camp inmate. He had been on hunger strike for something like 7 years and had received over 10,000 forced nasogastric feedings. We held his banner, and not long after we left, he was released. And interestingly, his attorney, Omar Farah, said he wasn't released because some judge said, you're innocent. There was no change of heart in the national security establishment. He was released because he made a nuisance of himself and refused to submit to the total control and domination of the United States government. And in a sense, freed himself from the most powerful military apparatus in the history of the world through his own determination and his own tenacity. And there's something, very moving about his freedom. The last phase, and I might run literally 1 minute over, or 2 minutes over, the Trump phase, which I call the no news is good news phase, right? And Trump didn't load up Guantanamo with more quote unquote bad dudes. He didn't restart the torture program. The status quo felt like more or less a victory. And yet you had during this period what I call the generalization of Guantanamo, or the Gitmoization of American politics. And then I'll list sort of 3 or 4 ways in which I saw this manifest and then, close. Guantanamo was all about the demonization of the foreign brown-skinned criminal other. And then we saw during Trump the Muslim terrorists being replaced by the migrant murderer and rapist, right? And then similar discourses of demonization, marginalization, and abjection characterized these populations, marked as other and subject to various forms of state violence. We also saw the sort of sedimentation of the big lie. We would say years ago that the big lie of Guantanamo is that it houses the worst of the worst, right? If you accept the premise that these are sociopathic mass murderers, you don't really care if they're treated abusively, because that abuse is just punishment for horrible crimes. And yet most of the men at Guantanamo were more or less completely innocent, and all of them should be endowed with basic human rights and rights of due process. And now we see the big lie as the centerpiece of really the fascist movement that Trump is in the process of leading. Gaslighting as well, the sense this isn't torture. Whatever it is, it somehow falls short of some moral or legal definition of torture, when of course we knew it was torture. And then gaslighting has been, a sort of feature of the last 4 years. Quickly, the compact of the Republican Party with a kind of moral evil. I mean, there's a pro-torture constituency within the American political establishment. And now that constituency has aligned itself with illiberal anti-democratic politics. And then finally, I'll invoke this notion that you may have heard, that the cruelty is the point, right? This is, a pundit's sort of description of the logic of much of Trump's policies and broader ethos. Yes, the notion that America is stronger and more vital and secure in its identity if it is inflicting violence on marginal and vulnerable others. And then this is, I think, the core logic of Guantanamo, which has been, elevated over the last 4 years. And I leave it as an open question what phase we are in now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. Thank you. So now we'll take some questions. So if anyone has any questions for Jeremy, please pop it in the chat or raise your hand, your virtual hand. Sorry, I'm just seeing if there are any questions.
Hi there, I'll raise my hand.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, David.
A lot of when we're talking about the administrations, we will say it's the Bush administration, it's Obama, it's Biden. But on the other hand, when Trump was president and Trump would try to tweet something out, we're going to do this from now on, everything's going to change. All of us, all the all the people that didn't like Trump, let's say, were very happy that that wasn't the case, that he couldn't just, snap his fingers and make things change. There was the State Department, they might get in the way. The Justice Department might get in the way. The professionals within the Pentagon might resist what Trump wanted to do. We were celebrating that. We were happy that there was a separation of powers, that there was an established kind of establishment that would stand up to Trump. But I kind of feel like we can't have it both ways. We can't, on the one hand, celebrate a working democracy that puts obstacles in the way of somebody like Trump, but on the other hand, if Biden comes in, we want him to wave a magic wand and make everything go away. And I was wondering if, I mean, if I was going to write a letter, as I do, as we do, I'm with the Lewis Amnesty Group, so we are gathering signatures, we are writing letters. If we were going to aim that letter at the part of the government that is putting up the most resistance to closing Guantanamo, where would you say that resistance is coming from? What part of it? Is it the Pentagon? Is it the intelligence services? Who has the biggest vested interest in keeping Guantanamo open?
It's a superb question, and I understand the first part. That we don't want the arbitrary exercise of authority. We want checks and balances. Does that not apply in efforts to close Guantanamo? Well, let's set that aside for a second. I mean, we long saw Guantanamo as a total systems failure in which every major branch and institution of government was complicit, from the executive to the judiciary to the intelligence apparatus to Congress. And they all need to be held to account. There's been a game of hot potato, where under Trump we would tell sympathetic Congress people, what can you do to close Guantanamo? And they would say, geez, with Trump in office, it's kind of impossible. Under Obama, they would say, yeah, we're on your side, but with a Republican-led Congress, it's kind of impossible. So there's blame shifting, and the refusal to expend political capital. I mean, Guantanamo was created by the executive branch, and I think it's ultimately the responsibility of the executive branch to close. And Amnesty and other groups have laid out detailed protocols and steps that the Biden administration, could take. And then when it comes to something like deference to Congress, the arguments of opponents of closing Guantanamo in Congress are based on lies and made in utterly bad faith, exaggerated figures about recidivism, the notion that freeing, a 70-year-old guy suffering from dementia and liver failure somehow represents, a threat to the United States. And, who's invested in Guantanamo any longer? It's hard to say. I think Republicans continue to love to demagogue around Democrats being soft on, terrorism. So it's a sort of perpetual talking point for them. But to some extent, we have a prison that no one any longer really wants. And it lives on in zombie-like fashion as this monster that seems almost ineradicable from, the American body politic. And then that's an absurdity, something that's so grotesque and so criminal and such a profound violation of everything America claims to stand for. We can't institutionally demobilize and retire. I mean, we're in the realm of sort of moral absurdity, much as I appreciate and have run into all of the barriers that your question cited or implies.
Yeah. Oh, well, it sounds kind of like the POW MIA flag, that flies in all these little towns in America, as if there were still prisoners of war somewhere in Vietnam that have to be rescued. Like, everybody knows it's not true, but like nobody wants to take the flags down because they're too wimpy. Anyway, thank you for that answer.
Thank you so much for your question, David. Just to let you know, everyone, you can still ask your questions in the chat. There's one question in the chat for you, as another question for you, Jeremy. It is, what now? How should US people channel their activism to close Guantanamo?
Right. I mean, there's, a working group that meets regularly that includes Amnesty and Center for Constitutional Rights, Witness Against Torture, Refuse Fascism, a host of other organizations. And this is the question that we, sort of live with every day. And our approach has been to use whatever means we have to exert pressure on the Biden administration. And I would say more than anything else, it's a moral appeal that they exercise their own conscience to execute their own stated policy. But properly speaking, we have zero means of institutional leverage. And the idea of mobilizing a massive public constituency to make an issue of this is not available to us. So we're counting on elected officials, to do the right thing and follow through on their own stated intentions. And then just to, sort of answer a question I posed, I'm afraid that we're back in the political phase of this struggle. Biden took enormous flack for the way he left Afghanistan, right? And then the right is saying you are exacerbating the terrorist threat. And if somebody is released from Guantánamo now, people will say, look, Biden is jeopardizing the security of the United States, which is completely absurd because Trump had negotiated an agreement by which 5,000 Taliban were freed from prisons in Afghanistan. But in America, optics are everything and reality counts for almost nothing. And then my worry is that current political circumstances are going to make the Biden administration very wary of doing anything that appears soft on terrorism. My hope is that there's a sort of institutional bureaucratic momentum generated by the PRBs and efforts at transfer diplomacy that are immune to those kind of political calculations, but that frankly is my worry.
Thank you very much for your answer, Jeremy. Thank you. And thank you for your time and your presentation. So next, we're going to be moving